in Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and also the modern history of Sri Lanka. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome to Harvard Rohini Mohan, who is the author of the book The Seasons of Trouble, which will be the subject of the discussion this afternoon. And we'll also have reply after Rohini Mohan reads and speaks a little bit about and from the book. The reply will be from Vivi Ganeshananthan, or known as Sugi. And then we can have a discussion. Let me just, before we open it up, for me to just say some things about my own admiration of the book. One of the striking things for me reading the book is there's 350 pages of accounts of 3 individuals in post-war Sri Lanka, what happened to them towards the end of the war and then afterwards. And then 3 pages on the history of the Civil War. And that, the proportionality of 350 pages about these 3 people and 3 pages about the history, I think is extremely significant. And that one of the things to just say is that by paying attention to what's happening to these individuals, what has happened to them, and what they've had to face, we see a different kind of way of perceiving the war than we've ever had the opportunity to see before. So I'm not sure it's right to say we see a human face to the war and after the war, but there's something that is being conveyed to us that's harder from the more standard histories that give us big data and statistics and causes of this or that. The other thing I just wanted to say of my own reaction to reading the book is that I remember something that a friend of mine who lives in Chennai had said at the end of the war, the fall of the LTT, but I've heard a number of Tamil people both from India and Sri Lanka say. But what he said was that the LTT victory would not be my victory, but the defeat of the LTT is my defeat. And in that, when I heard those statements, I often thought it was something to do with kind of identities of being Tamil. But after reading Rohini Mohan's book myself, I would say that I want to say something similar. An LTT victory would not be my victory, but the LTT defeat and what has happened is my defeat, because there's a kind of sadness and horror at what has been the result of the end of the war. You kind of feel drawn into it and implicated in it as well. So with that, let me just turn over and welcome Rohini Mohan, who is our featured speaker this afternoon.
Thank you. That was really interesting, actually, that I myself didn't think of the proportionality of the pages, because that was my entry point, actually, into Sri Lanka, that however much I read about it, it didn't seem to be, the stuff that I read didn't encapsulate for me exactly what happened. And at least that was my attempt to go towards that, to try and take those paragraphs that I would see everywhere about the Sri Lankan war, the conflict, that, it was a 30-year-old conflict. It was between the Sinhalese-dominated government of Sri Lanka and the Sinhalese-dominated army versus the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam that were representing the Tamil civilians, and the proportions of the demographics, that is the majority Sinhalese population versus the minority Tamils and Muslims. These were words that came up in history textbooks, I guess, and also a lot of the articles that I read. There was the stock paragraph that would be there in all journalistic writings. But it didn't seem to encapsulate enough of what actually went on in Sri Lanka. And that was the entry point of my book. It started out as a master's thesis, actually. That was the first time I visited Sri Lanka as a journalist. This was in 2009, December. So May 2009 was when the war ended and the LTT was eliminated. And I went there in December, visited people at relief, at the refugee camps, people moving from the refugee camps to their homes, which were, whatever was left of their homes in the north of Sri Lanka, which is where most of the Tamils lived, at least under the LTT. And then I went back there often, twice or thrice a year for a period of a month or more. I live in India. I grew up in Bangalore. I did not grow up with knowledge of the Sri Lankan conflict or of Sri Lankan people. and my introduction to it was these incomplete histories everywhere. So a part of me also wanted to know that there was what was the effect and what was the shape of a war that happened so close to my home, and that I didn't really fully know still. Also, as a journalist, I had at that point worked for 5 years in India as a journalist, and I had covered communal tensions. I'd covered identity issues, poverty, effects of many different kinds of context of underprivileged people. But somehow Sri Lanka seemed to be the place where I would somehow marry all of those things. I would understand it in a larger context. So after going back there, I met one of the characters that I met, one of the people that I met in the refugee camp actually challenged me and said, I know you're not going to come back, and why do you people come here and ask us these questions and go back? It was a 5-minute interview, and she continued to be the person that I went back to, and she's there in the book. She's a former, in the book her name is Mugil. She's a former LTT child soldier. When I met her, she had been one of the few people who had slipped under the radar of the Sri Lankan army and had not surrendered. Because she had 2 very young sons that she had to take care of. The rest of her family, who were also in the LTT, had surrendered. So I met her, and we had a lot of conversations, and it told me, and I mean, some of the first questions that I asked her were about recruitment in the LTT and what she thought about the LTT, but what she wanted to talk about were what she witnessed in the end of the war, and that's how our conversations actually began. Then the other person that I write about is Sarva, who's also around 30 years old. He was about 28 when I first heard of him. He was a missing person, and his mother was looking for him. He was picked off the street in Colombo. Sri Lanka has the second largest number of enforced disappearances in the world after Iraq, and he was one of those people who disappeared. And his mother was looking for him, had no idea, had not heard of him after he just would not answer his phone for 2 days. So this is the person I wrote about, and after I tracked his mother, who I call Indra in the book. I spoke to her for 4 years, and the 5th year I met him. He turned up in London because he had somehow got there. He had escaped. He had been through a lot of horrifying things after he was detained by the terrorist investigation department in Colombo, and he escaped from prison. He escaped from that. He had a harrowing tale to tell, which even his mother didn't fully know about. And he was in London seeking political asylum. So I was able to interview him for 3 months in the UK, and what he told me in that time was filled in all the gaps, and was also much more open than, I could speak to him much more openly than the other two, because the other two still live in Sri Lanka, and that's why I have to change their name, and their names are different in the book. Sarva, who is the young man who was kidnapped, his name is the same. He lives in London now. He's safe. So he allowed me to write his name. So I think however much I talk about it, I think it would be best if I just read a couple of sections. The first section is, the time is set, and I write it chronologically, and I shift between the people that I'm writing about. I chose to write about these 3, although I interviewed about 8 people in depth. I've interviewed, as a journalist, I've interviewed as many number of people as I can from all sides of the conflict, politicians, civilians, former combatants, journalists, activists, people who live in Sri Lanka still, people who live outside of it in other parts of the world, to get a kind of whole-rounded, well-rounded a perspective as I could get. So I'll just read this section, which is about Sarva. He, at this point, this is June 2008, he was a mechanic on a merchant ship, and that was his job. He was looking to go to Greece. That was his next assignment. He's just been to the doctors. He's got a medical certificate certifying him okay, and he's now going to give that to his employer. The trishaw drove past the Petta bus stops, honking and weaving through the hordes of people crossing the road. The recruitment office Sarva wanted was at Armour Street, and they were almost there. There was no reason to hurry. June in Sri Lanka brought on everyone's worst mood. The oppressive humidity and heat seeped right through one's clothes and into one's nerves. The stream of shops selling mobile phones and pirated CDs gave way to forklifts, iron scrap, and hardware shops. This part of Colombo always looked plundered, the predominance of grey concrete and rusted metal signaling heavy demolitions just beyond view. The trishaw driver asked Sarva in Sinhala if he was sick. He had seen the stamp of the doctor's office on his papers. "No, it's just a checkup for a job on a ship," Sarva replied in Sinhala from the back seat. He scooted closer to the driver. When he bent his head to meet the driver's eye in the rearview mirror, Sarva saw, from under the decorations hanging on the windshield, a white van standing near the recruitment office across the road. The trishaw driver didn't seem to notice it. He was making a U-turn around some workers digging up the road. Sarva felt his heart race. This was not good. No white van was ever good. "Turn around," Sarva hissed. The driver looked over his shoulder. Did we miss the place? At that moment, 4 men got out of the van. 2 of them started to walk towards them. "Turn around," Sarva was shouting now. The driver hit his brakes and was just shifting to reverse when the 2 men from the van caught up and hopped in. "Who are you?" Sarva stammered, trying to squeeze out of the now cramped back seat. One of the men then grabbed Sarva by the trousers, removed his belt, and pushed him out of the vehicle in one motion. They took everything off him: the medical report, his wallet, his mobile phone. They used the belt to tie Sarva's hands at his back. At the wide car park nearby, with traffic still whizzing past, the bigger man threw Sarva on his knees. Standing above him, the other man screamed questions at him. "Is your name Sarva?" "Yes." "Do you have 3 artificial front teeth?" "Yes." "Have you been to the Vanni?" "No, no." By now the trishaw driver had begun to yell, "Kidnap! Help!" A small crowd of laborers gathered around them. Some people were shouting, "Hey, what's happening?" One of the men from the van flashed them an ID, held it high above his head. He was a plainclothes policeman, he said. Pointing to Sarva, he snarled, "This is a Kutia, a tiger, a Tamil militant." The driver fell silent, the crowd disappeared. Later, Sarva would wonder what happened to the driver after that. Did he drive away, in fear, in indifference, or hate? Did he wait to be paid for helping them set this trap? No one could be trusted. The men dragged Sarva towards the white van. Its windows were tinted and rolled up. He was made to crouch in front of the passenger seat beside the driver. A man clambered onto the seat and pressed his feet to Sarva's back. The door was slid shut. He counted 6 or 7 men before he was blindfolded. They drove for about half an hour, perhaps less. Sarva swayed with the sharp turns the van was making. The man above him gripped Sarva's curly hair to keep his balance, but did not remove his hand afterwards. Dirty boots dug into his back, and now this hand. Sarva had seen goats taken like this to the slaughterhouse, bleating all the way. A Muslim butcher in Negombo once told him he always killed the noisiest goat first. The quiet ones were smarter, Sarva had decided. Sure, they were still going the same way as the rest, but they managed to stay alive a little longer. He tried to quieten his thudding heart. He breathed more slowly. He wanted to heighten his other senses. In school, a rich boy who had been kidnapped for ransom had led the police to his kidnapper's lair entirely by retracing the sounds he had heard while they drove him around blindfolded. Sarva tried that now. But inside the van, no one spoke a word. The traffic noise and honking had begun to subside. He couldn't focus. Why is this happening to me? He wondered. The van slowed down for what seemed to be a gate and then stopped. Sarva heard the door open and through his blindfold saw light flood in. He was pulled out of the van and taken up some steps. He heard a ship's horn. That gave him his first piece of real information. He was somewhere near Colombo's harbor. So that was from the first chapter, and that was the defining moment, in a sense, of Sarva's life at that point. It was actually one of the things that he remembered most clearly. And with my repeated interviews with him, very rarely did he veer from this. He remembered almost everything that happened to him in that moment. I'll read another section, which is in May 2011. This is almost exactly 2 years after the end of the war. This is about Mugil, and the previous, what I read previously was taking place in Colombo, which is the capital of Sri Lanka in the south. What I'm going to read now is happening in a town which is the biggest northmost town in Sri Lanka. It's called Point Pedro. At one point in the 30 years of war, it was affected by the war, but it was not part of the final war. And Mugil, after she left the refugee camp, is now living there in an abandoned house. She moved into a house someone else had abandoned. She's living there with her 2 children, who are 4 and 2. It was May 2011, and Mugil needed a job. She did not have much of a formal education, but she could ride a motorbike, use a camera, even climb a coconut tree. She was fluent in Tamil, good with numbers, and had a way with people. But she had begun to have misgivings about displaying these skills, lest she be identified as a former combatant. Things had shifted inside her. Her life was no longer dedicated to the movement, but the state would not see that. The Terrorist Investigation Department and Army would find little to distinguish the unrepentant from the transformed, and give her no credit for deserting the Tigers. She would be pushed back to the edge. She knew that hiding was perhaps unfair to those who had surrendered, like her own husband and brother. But there were her children, and the need to raise them defeated all other moral concerns. It wasn't easy to be invisible. She knew the rules but hadn't absorbed them. Good family women didn't go to the market after dusk. They didn't sit near a man on the bus. They didn't draw attention. A loud voice, short temper, or confident walk was enough to get one into trouble. Her sister knew of a primary school teacher who organized a sports day without following the recent practice of inviting an army official as a guest of honor. She was banned from leaving her village without military permission for a month. A young man, an acquaintance of Mugil's from Valvetiturai, went missing after he turned down a soldier's offer of a beer. "I don't have such habits," the customers in the tea shop had heard him say. Only a former combatant, the powers that be seemed to surmise, would have the prepossession to both refuse alcohol and do so looking a soldier in the eye. It did not help that the young man belonged to Prabhakaran's hometown. Being female itself invited danger. Mugil knew 7 women in her neighborhood who had become more vulnerable after the killing or kidnapping of their husbands. They told her in whispers how the soldiers used the investigations as a pretext to come by after dark or to summon the women to the army office alone. One of them had been asked to send her teenage daughter. A woman could do no right. If she spoke to soldiers, she was easy. If she did not speak to them, she was rude or had something to hide. They were harassed for information or amusement. The mother of one of Maran's friends told Mugil that late one night a soldier walked in and slept next to her. Mugil knew that phrase to mean she had been raped. It was all as real as it was bizarre. there was no use going to the police, even if they were Tamils. The military ruled the north. 1 soldier for every 11 civilians. The government said this presence was necessary to weed out tigers, separatists, and antisocial elements. Those categories included anybody who didn't cower in fear of the military. Former tigers, surely, but also journalists, priests, association leaders, wisecracking boys, and women who recoiled from flirtation. The consequences of being picked out by the army were far-reaching and permanent. You could be detained for a long time. You could be prosecuted under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and who knew where that would lead? It felt dramatic and over the top at times, this dread of oppression, especially for those who had never experienced it before. The army's presence in Colombo had made the Sinhalese feel safe, and many asked why Tamils were so resistant to it. They were there for the Tamils' own good, they would say. But every time Mugil passed a soldier, her pulse raced, her palms sweated, and a terrifying image of her boys, orphaned and wailing alone, flashed through her mind. She imagined being plucked off the street and being plunged into darkness. She sometimes scoffed at her fear, told herself it was paranoia, but it still gripped her. It had happened to others, too many innocent others. She fought to subdue her confident stride and straight back, kept her voice soft, did not run as fast as she could to catch a bus. She would hitch one of her sons on her hip when approaching a checkpoint. It was not enough that she was harmless. She needed to be seen to be harmless. It was not just the army's watchful eyes she had to worry about. The Tamil community was unforgiving to combatants after the war, calling them traitors. They accused the tigers of stealing from civilians on the run. For many, the former cadre were the lowest scum of society, the reason the army was apprehending innocent people and a force whose decrees had robbed families of their children, whose decades of promises had come to nothing. Some people swung wildly between feeling betrayed by the tigers and nostalgic for the era they represented. But the old loyalty had entirely dissipated. Ex-combatants were dreaded, avoided like the plague. Any association with them was considered too risky. Most people would give them up to the army without hesitation. No one wanted to employ them. Female ex-cadre faced the worst stigma. Those who were single were deemed unsuitable for marriage. They were too independent, too dangerous for any family. In gossip, their unwilling visits to the army camps were recast as sexual liaisons. The older women, married or widowed, were held to unforgivingly high standards of femininity and obedience. This was why, when Mugil mounted her bicycle, she kept her legs together, her eyes on the ground. She did not argue with men. She shrank. She play-acted frailty for the comfort of others.
All right, thank you so much for the reading. To give you a little context for why I'm here, I'm Sugi Ganeshananthan. I am a journalist and a fiction writer, at this point primarily a fiction writer, and Rohini and I have known each other for some years, I guess for the entirety of the time that she worked on this book. And we were both students at Columbia Journalism School, a few years apart from each other, and that was how we met. And I thought rather than having the sort of very standard response to reading this, because our conversation about this book has gone on for so long and contains such variety, that I would talk a little bit about what I thought about the book and the observations that I had as you were working on it, and then also ask Rohini a few questions before it is turned over to you for Q&A. So when you first started working on this book, one of the reasons I was so thrilled that you wanted to do reportage in Sri Lanka, I mean, there were multiple reasons. As a media critic and as a close follower of news coverage of Sri Lanka, the things that I felt were undercovered included specifically the issues affecting women and children, the issues affecting minority communities, the issues affecting the displaced. And I thought also that the relationship, the nuance of the relationship between India and Sri Lanka had perhaps not been explored in its most human terms. So I was really excited to meet an Indian journalist who was a woman who spoke Tamil, and who was interested in writing about the lives of Tamil civilians, because the majority of the reportage that I had been reading for the past several years had been done by very many committed journalists, certainly, but very rarely someone who had the kind of access to speak directly to Tamil women about what exactly their lives were like during the end of the war and also in post-war Sri Lanka. So that direct quality, despite a number of other excellent books that are out there, and I think here of books like The Cage by Gordon Weiss, which was, he was the UN spokesperson in Sri Lanka at the end of the war and subsequently wrote a book, or Still Counting the Dead by former BBC correspondent Francis Harrison. There are a lot of nonfiction books out there about Sri Lanka, but none had taken this approach. And I really thought that in sort of war narratives in general, and particularly in Sri Lanka, that the narratives of women under military occupation in heavily militarized areas had been erased. And so I was really excited to talk to someone who wanted to do this kind of reporting. I also wanted to note that, you know, I frequently review books, fiction and nonfiction. When I was reading this book, especially when I was reading its later drafts, one of the books I was most strongly reminded of was Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which came out very recently, and also has this quality of being of such, I don't want to call it fictional tactics or whatever a lot of people wanted to say about that book, because I think that those tactics are also available to nonfiction writers. But it sort of has a power of narrative that's really sort of compelling, sweeps you along, allows you to forget in some cases that the journalist is there, which is interesting considering I was so excited about this particular journalist writing it, and yet also so compelled by being very much in the heads of the characters. As you can hear from the passages that Rohini read aloud, we are very much in Sarva's point of view, in Mugil's point of view. So we are actually with their thoughts, which is, you know, one of my favorite aspects of creative nonfiction, but also one that takes considerable time to achieve. And I mean, this is a specific decision that this book makes. You know, Rohini at the beginning of it, you know, offers an introduction and then essentially takes herself out of it, and allows you simply to watch these three characters and their lives unfold. Charlie referred to the proportionality of the book, its focus on these human lives, and then its very brief explication of the enormously complex history, which I suspect some of you have waded through. And I know that I have faced, as a fiction writer and as a journalist, considerable challenges in thinking about what kind of boilerplate I use to describe Sri Lankan history, and on the many occasions in which I'm called to describe Sri Lankan history. You know, you've got 5 minutes, go, draw a map, give me the demographics. It's really awful. And the really specific choice also that Rohini made to focus on three individuals in particular, and also in sort of Sri Lankan political discourse as it is, there's the facade of balance. We will have one person from each ethnic group and or political faction on a panel, and then think that that produces something productive, versus sort of a willingness to admit that not everything on Sri Lanka need be exhaustive in that sort of surface sense, and instead to take kind of a deep dive on how a particular community was affected, which of course doesn't eliminate the questions of how the other communities were affected, but perhaps allows for some more complexity to the conversation. So these are many of the reasons I was excited about this particular project when Rohini and I met, which I guess would have been in 2010. Is that right? 2009, right as the war was ending. And that was also a period of time at which a number of people felt quite optimistic about what might happen after, you know, this 30-year conflict, there's that boilerplate, had concluded. You know, what kind of future could Sri Lankans of multiple communities, what kind of future could they be looking for? And we weren't sure of the answer to that. And also how long it might take to arrive at such an answer. So I think also the period of time that the book covers, which is quite long, is really helpful to developing a nuanced picture of the long-term effects of militarization, on a minority community, of the effects of, again, militarization on women, on children, the psychosocial effects of trauma, of displacement, which is an extremely common experience among Sri Lankans. At some point I had some terrible statistic of how often your average Sri Lankan had been displaced, which I can't presently summon. But I thought that these were things, that sort of transient, that forced displacement, which is so common to the Sri Lankan war narrative and which seems to have gone past the war's end, I think is captured really, really beautifully here. But in selecting all of these things, of course, Rohini has not selected other things. She chose to write about 2 women and 1 young man, and then as a result had to leave out other things. You heard her speak about the fact that she interviewed so many people. And so I thought I might ask her to talk a little bit about how she made the decisions about who to include and how she came to shape the narrative with these 3 people who don't all know each other and whose lives might not necessarily automatically fit themselves into the shape of a book. If you would talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it was interesting that how much of their lives were similar, or the effects that they felt on their lives were similar, although they had never met each other. So it was the thing that I struggled with while I was trying to write a narrative which would flow and which would seem like one life spoke to another, which to me it did as I was interviewing them. But while writing it, it seemed as if, and almost everyone that was that I was talking to felt that I should make them meet, or somehow engineer a meeting, or find an event around which to write about them, where they had all been there in the same room. So when I wrote, for example, I did that with a piece, the only published article I wrote in those 5 years that I was reporting in Sri Lanka. If I had published more, I probably would not have been able to go back to Sri Lanka. And the one that I published also, I published anonymously. And in that piece, I made that one moment, the killing of Prabhakaran, the LTT chief, and how different characters or different people in the refugee camp heard about it, and then what happened to them. So that was somehow the way of including, to kind of show how they were connected, but how they didn't have to be. And somehow after writing that, it freed me up to not do that, to not engineer that meeting. And in the book, they don't meet. But to me, their lives were interconnected because of the places that they came from, the language they spoke, the effect or the stereotypes they had to inhabit because of the government, because of the army, because of pressures from their own community. So to me, somehow it spoke, and I hope it speaks to each other. For example, the 2 things that I read in which Sarva is detained, is kidnapped in 2008 June, and Mugil's fear of that happening to her 2 years later, 3 years later, is connected. And also the law that pulls everyone into this dark void is what is hanging over everybody. But there were other people that I wish I could have written about that somehow, because you have to make choices, I didn't. And I hope to write about them at some other point in different forms that are, I tell myself that it's inexhaustible sort of material, so therefore I can keep writing about it, but maybe not in this book. So those people are Sinhalese activists, Sinhalese civilians, soldiers, one soldier. It's very difficult to get access to more. Very young soldier who was also around the same age. My idea was also to get people who lived as long as the war, who were around 30 years old. Therefore, they were coming into peace or post-war situation, fresh off a life where they had only seen war. But this person, access is a huge difficulty with people within government. With these people also it was really difficult, but because I kept going back and I spoke the language, they trusted me after a point. The other people that I left out was a Jaffna University student. So there were issues of my trusting his narrative there, because there were many things that he said that I could not corroborate. And also that he didn't give me access to the entire family or community the way these people did. he didn't ever allow me to meet his parents or his girlfriend. In fact, he didn't want me to write about his girlfriend, which is, I understand, but they were not things I could justify in the narrative. These people have also spoken to me at length about their lives, but also left out things which I am very aware of, and I try to include that gray area in the narrative where I am not sure, because they are either not sure or they don't want me to know. There are other parts where they have allowed me to know something which even their families don't, and that is stuff that I have not included. Because, I mean, in a journalistic, I guess, whatever contract of trust, forget the journalistic contract, but the contract of trust, they explicitly told me not to include it, so I haven't. But those are not compromising the rest of the story, so that I'm comfortable with not writing about them. Yeah, so it's the decision, and another person that I didn't include is myself.
Right.
So my going through, which I felt, frankly, I don't find myself as interesting as so many other things that I found there. So if I have to justify a person in the book, every scene or every character that I have to justify, I couldn't justify my appearance in the book. And as a journalist, it's not, to show the methodology itself in which I ask them questions and they reply, or what I feel about them, it was more challenging for me to express those things in a different way through the narrative, through what they were telling me or telling someone else than what I was asking them. So, I've read too many non-fiction books written by journalists or travelers that go that way. So, maybe I just wanted to be different also. That's enough of a compelling reason for me.
Right. So what were you reading as models for what you wanted your book to be?
So apart from a lot of nonfiction for the context and the history, actually I was reading a lot of fiction. Because I feel like stories, for example, I was reading other fiction, most fiction that was not set in the US or England, that was set somewhere else. And how I could write about it without exoticizing, to kind of that's how I was reading to write, to not exoticize, to understand that, showing the difference without explaining everything, to not explain a vada into a savory donut.
I do really hate that.
Yeah, or, not have a paragraph on a mango, just things that annoy me were things that I was trying not to do, which is why I was reading other books, to kind of get that language inside. So Adichie, lots of older books, and also masculine narratives, I guess. I call them masculine narratives because I was very conscious of a very male perspective, and also the absence of women or of them as appendages in some way. I was reading that to not do that, which is a lot of nonfiction actually. Then I guess there was A Common Ground, which is, I guess, Boston story, and that was also actually about three families: an Irish family, a black family, and during the busing crisis, I guess. So it was interesting to me that was possible, and there's fiction and non-fiction have done it in different ways, and then I sort of stopped reading to just write. And there was also, I guess, films, different to understand what appeals to me about an image, and what is missing in that image when I'm writing. And I was trying to. I feel most compelled by a photograph or someone telling me a story about what happened to them, a first-person narrative, and I feel a lot of people do. So that's kind of what I was trying to do, and it's not a story that begins, this day I met somebody who went through this, is far more interesting than in 1985 you just fall asleep, for me at least. So that fiction gave me that that structure, and also freed me up to not feel, while always being conscious of the journey. I had my notes on one side and all the fiction on the other side. So yeah.
So as you were teaching yourself to expand that kind of language, you were at the same time doing reporting in Tamil in a dialect that is, in a version of the language that is different from what you were what you spoke, and you had to expand your vocabulary in other ways. I remember you telling me a little bit about sort of you interviewing people and them using words that you weren't sure of. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to report in Tamil that was Tamil but was different than yours?
Yeah, it was just so interesting that a lot of people outside of the war-affected areas, outside of the Vanni, which is where the LTT was, and a lot of most Tamils live there in Sri Lanka. People outside of that who had exposure to Tamil films that were made in India could understand my language. I didn't grow up in Tamil Nadu, so my Tamil was even removed. There are so many dialects within Tamil Nadu, and then I had a dialect of people who speak Tamil in Bangalore, and it was inflected by my Kerala connections, and so it was somehow they understood my questions, and I asked them several times. Often also it helped that I didn't ask a direct question. I would start, if I met them in the morning, we would talk about breakfast, and the breakfast would connect them to the days they didn't have breakfast during the end of the war, because it helped that I was there from 2009 December when the memories were fresh, the wounds were really raw, and I didn't have to ask them for them to come up. Once they trusted me, they would just talk about it. And the other thing was that when they would answer, people outside of the Vanni, I could still understand them largely. And when I didn't understand people, especially from the Vanni, I would just write it, phonetically, I would just write it down and sort of, and I was taking notes in English. I don't read or write Tamil, but I speak it. So whatever they would say, I would just write it down straight in English. And then later go and ask someone else who I was more comfortable asking stupid questions to. I would ask them, what does this mean? And sometimes also it was to refer to some things. For example, the words that they were all using for cluster bombs. Until some years, like 2011, nobody was using those words. They were just describing the bomb. And it was interesting to me that now suddenly the same people were using that word. It came from the UN report, came from other places where people whose descriptions were the same. I mean, it was identified as a cluster bomb. So I was aware that they were responding to other sources of information, and so now they have a new language, which a military language also, especially that the LTT people who had been in the LTT or lived around them had, which I have no knowledge of. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, they would say if that is a one gun, I know. But apart from that, the kind of bombs they had, the kind of the different shapes of bunkers, or the different units and squadrons, and when they would say unit or squadron, I wouldn't know where. They knew that one thing meant Navy and one thing meant Army, one thing meant the LTT ground force, but I didn't know that difference. So there were some people who would explain it to me. Some people, most people were very happy to do it. They would draw diagrams of the bullets, of the different shapes of the guns, of the shells. Some other people, they had to do all of this also because there was no record of, they didn't even have pictures. They lost everything in the war. They didn't have a photograph of their house or what they used to wear. So a lot of it had to be descriptions, and because they were also eager to record, they were doing it for me. And the other languages, other difficulties in language was the fact that, that the Tamil, especially of those who lived in the Vanni, has no English words. So it's also quite different from even the textbook Tamil that is spoken or written in Tamil Nadu, and it is also deeply inflected with the militant propaganda language. So I had to understand that, for example, when they spoke of a person dying, they would not say he died. They would say he was martyred. The word was Veera Chaval. So they would say that, and that meant like a death of valor. So every time they said that, I thought that it meant a combatant's death, but it meant a civilian's death also. It was just that they were all counted as martyrdom because that would further the cause of militancy. So I had to understand this, and being kind of hearing these words and also being aware of my limitations of the language helped me. And by the end of it, of course, now I think I can mostly have a conversation, or at least understand them fully. So it helped that I was asking them the same questions again And after a point, they understood that I was not understanding, so they were willing to explain.
Right. Well, maybe I'll ask one or two more questions and then we'll turn it over to all of you. It's interesting to hear you talk about the language difficulties. I also wonder if you can talk a little bit about just sort of the amount of time that this took, because I remember when we first started talking about your project, it was your master's thesis and you were gonna have to turn it in a certain date. And then when you're working on a book project, and it's about a post-war scenario, then what sort of deadline are you looking at? You know, when you started working on this book, you had a much broader conception of it, I think, with much less of an idea of how things would shape up. But I'm also, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't know that you thought it was going to take that much time.
It wasn't supposed to be a book. It was supposed to be a master's thesis and maybe an article, but that's all it was supposed to be. Yeah. But because I felt, I don't know, the guilt of being an outsider was large. It was hanging over me a lot, and that somehow made me go back over and over. Also the relationships that I built there, not just with these people, but a lot of people in Colombo that were feeling different kinds of effects of the war, of an oppressive government, and at the same time there were changes going on in India, where I'm from, which I was feeling afraid of, which I was feeling were going towards a sort of authoritarian government, and I was seeing that happen in Sri Lanka. So there were several reasons for me to go back, and the broader conception also included hope, because after my first field visit, a lot of people spoke about hope because the government spoke in those terms. They spoke about policies that would change things and make the country more equal, which as I noticed, as I kept going back, I found that they were not. And the same people that were ready to criticize the LTT and look to the government for help and for aid and for hope were going back to feeling nostalgic about the LTT and the time of war, which was really, I mean, it was shocking to me that that kind of hope and that opportunity could be wasted so easily, and move on to something else where now another minority was the focus, or the target of attacks, with a government that was becoming more triumphalist and kind of, even in the landscape, even showing the polarized system, showing also the sort of the lack of thought of, even when they announce policies, the lack of the methods that are not thought through fully, the militarization, and all of this was not stuff that I expected. So I was finding, all I wanted was to seek an answer or to understand what happens to an identity that has been defined in a certain way for so long, for 30 years, and then now how does it fit into a new Sri Lanka? That's what I wanted to know, but that's the underlying question, I guess. But there was so much else happening that I did not feel ready to write an article or at all. So I just kept going back, and at some point, organically, it just became so huge that I thought, and I had to write a book, and then it is my first book, so that took some time personally for me to accept that maybe I should do it as a project that is going to be a book. So it's also that by that time there were people asking me questions that the people I was interviewing, they were asking for accountability from me. You have all these stories, what are you doing with them? Where is it? I don't see it. Are you giving it to someone else? Are you from RAW? So they were, which is.
You were from RAW?
Yeah, it was a question I got a lot, and I thought it was paranoia, but I later found I understand that it's a legitimate fear that I was a spy from India, which they had a lot of at some point. So it was all of these things when they were asking me why are you still here, and also their boredom after a point on seeing me, and also they don't want to hear my questions anymore. So I had to put it down. So I wrote a little bit to show one of the people that I was interviewing actually an activist who could read English, and he said that he was going to courts for his own. I mean, he had to appear in court to get permission to leave the country for different visits, and he was sitting in courts and reading it, and he said that, okay, now you should just write more. So that kind of gave me confidence to continue to write.
All right, should we?
So we can turn to questions and answers for either Rohini or Sugi. The one thing they ask is that we have a microphone to use, so if you're asking the questions, you just wait until the microphone comes to you.
Is the microphone working? Or?
It's for the video.
Oh, okay. Could you say a bit about what audiences you were thinking of in writing the book? And sort of as a related question, have you given thought to the possible distribution of the book in Sri Lanka itself?
Yeah. It was Sri Lankans. So at one level, I was thinking of people who started out, who would be like me when I started out, that had a bit of an interest, or not, if not just in Sri Lanka, in civil wars, or in non-fiction, or just in stories. That's a broad group of people, I guess. And also, so those people, which is why I had to enter it as if they didn't know anything. At the same time, I also did think of people who would know everything about Sri Lanka, so that I had fear in my heart, and to kind of. So there were some paragraphs that I sent to some people in Sri Lanka, or people who know Sri Lanka really well, and they gave me different inputs, and I understood, how to enter that gray area, or I made a choice of what I believe more, or what is on record better. So these kind of two extremes of people who know nothing and people who know a lot, they were in my head, and of course, as I was writing, it was the people. What if this book was read by the person I was writing about? How much would they agree with it, and how much would they? How angry would they be with me, and for what reason? So, I guess these three groups of people. And as for distribution in Sri Lanka, there is the publisher in India, HarperCollins, will be trying to distribute it in Sri Lanka, and I don't think there will be events. I don't think that will be safe for the people that I've written about, even though I've changed their names. But there will be distribution in Sri Lanka, and I have to still figure out the translation, which I want to happen, which will be interesting because it will go from Tamil to English to Tamil, or Tamil to English to Sinhalese. I want it to be translated in both languages. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Divya. I'm a graduate student here, and I was wondering if you could expand more on the process of building trust with these people and what that experience was like for you. You mentioned earlier this overwhelming feeling of guilt, but I think it's a very unique relationship that you've fostered with these individuals. So one, how did you even go in and identify these individuals? And then I think one thing that I always wonder is when you report on people who are often not in positions of power in the typical sense, how do you convey to them where their story is going?
Okay, yeah. So the trust was, there have been failed relationships of trust that are not in the book. So I would say that it's not always easy. But these people, I think, so one thing was persistence, because I was turning up over and over, often not having conversations. Also going to their family events, which would not be big or whatever. Often they were funerals. I would be there. Also, we would keep in touch over phone as much as possible, over email with some others that gave me the context. Skype and Viber, which a lot of them use on their phones. And I guess in conversation, a lot of times I would not really ask them anything. I would just be there and then they would tell me what they were thinking about on that day. So often I would ask, so they didn't feel, I was trying also trying different things from what I was doing for a quick story, in India. I was going from doing a story over one day as a journalist to 1 week to 1 month to 2 months. And that was the point in which I started going to Sri Lanka, where I was feeling like, let me see if I can do this better. And I was thinking of it in a sort of oral histories kind of recording, where sometimes I just sit there and ask them, what were you thinking about today? I also left my dictaphone with them. I only sometimes use dictaphone whenever they were comfortable with it. Dictaphones freak them out, most people. They were really scared about it, about what it would be used. So what it would be used for in the future, where I would give it, and how they would get identified. So not often did I use dictaphones, but they were okay. If I gave them the dictaphone, they would keep it in there. I would give it an overnight, leave it with them and go and see them the next day, and they would have recorded something. It could be the children singing a rhyme they learned in school, or it could be something they were thinking of in the night, or they would have left it on and just, they were cooking. So I had all those sounds, so I had some idea. I had more context to their lives than just our interview, and that also let them feel, I think, that I was there much more than I was physically present. There was that. And what was the second part of your question?
How do you convey
The power, okay.
where it's going? Because
Yeah.
I think, like you mentioned, these relationships of trust, and it's a very risky thing in a way for them to.
Yeah, they were always reminding me of that risk, which is why actually all of the other two that I didn't mention, that I have not named, they actually allowed me to use their name, but I haven't still, because I just made a choice. One of them was very annoyed with me for that, was very angry that her name was not there, but I think, because especially after I'd spent so much time with her, but I explained to her that maybe there could be consequences that neither of us can foresee. So which is why I made that decision for her, which, maybe I was exerting some sort of power. She could have felt that way, and I think she did. But after I explained it, I think she was okay with it. Where it was going, I think all of them were very clear. That was one of the reasons for their trusting me after a point, that they were all very clear that they wanted the story to go out there, because they were very aware that they were not special in whatever had happened to them. It was unique, but not special, that many others had gone through this. And they wanted that, at least through them, because they could access me as a person who could go outside and go to other places and say the story. They were aware of it, and they were in fact holding me to that responsibility.
I'm Abhishek. I'm a graduate student at the Divinity School. So my question is also related to the audience, and something about identity that you talked about, your own identity. So you talked about how, as a Tamil, you grew up in Bangalore. That resonates a lot with me. I grew up in Delhi as a Tamil, and in many ways, for a long time, felt outside the Tamil Nadu Sri Lanka equation. How have you seen your book resonate with the audience of Tamil folks out there who do feel outside that equation, and how have they received the book? How has that affected them in any way?
I actually don't know. I don't know how many people have been able to read it yet. I think a lot of those people would be, at least if it's India, a lot of those people haven't got, just because it's not gotten there yet in India, it will be there next month. But in America and in England, where I have heard some people, I think they find it interesting. Actually, a lot of them said that they were already very interested in it, but they never knew enough. And it was an easy entry point in a way, that it was specific, like 3 people, instead of the large story. And many of them are actually looking to see if I will be embroiled in some controversy in Tamil Nadu, where there are still people with quite nationalistic feelings about the LTT and about Sri Lankan Tamils. So, and many of them have asked me if it is true that how do they frame the Tamil politicians the politics of Tamil Nadu, how does it fit into the Sri Lankan Tamil story? And I have been very clear about it being complete. It's an act of caring, at least today, in Tamil Nadu. So I guess we, as outsiders, may feel that we are not part of something that is being felt in Tamil Nadu. But I think that actually what we're seeing as maybe a farce is a farce. So that's what I felt as an outsider. And going into and also about other outsiders, that Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, Sri Lankan Sinhalese diaspora also came from very different. They reacted completely differently, and that was my beginning point actually. There were very few people like Sugi who gave me a kind of rounded perspective of what was happening, or that at least to question some of the assumptions about Sri Lanka. So which is why going there to Sri Lanka, and that's why I wrote nonfiction, so that we are not still under the impression of some stories and some propaganda that is even still written in Tamil press. So it is actually for those outsiders also to understand or to go as close as possible to what is really happening in Sri Lanka, because we feel that you're left out, but also whether you should be feeling more. I didn't come from that kind of emotional space which a lot of people in Tamil Nadu do. I think that is a freeing thing to see this.
Thank you. My name is Dinyar. I'm also a graduate student here. I was just wondering if the people you talk to, did they talk at all about the future, the post-conflict future, and if so, what did they talk about? Did their attitudes change over the course of your years talking to them?
I mean, this is actually, each time we were having a conversation, it was as much about the past as it was about the future, because one was determining the other. Actually, even the future conversations about all the events in their present were determining how they were seeing their past. It was also determining how they saw their future. So in a way, that's why I wrote it chronologically, because it keeps changing how they perceive what they want, how they see the government treating them, how they fit into the community, and how they read their past. I mean, an example is that Mugil, who in the beginning of the book is, I started that point because that was she witnesses a rape in the beginning, and that was a conversation she related it to me once, and when I met her a year later and asked her again, she said, "I've told you, but I'm not going to say it again," because even in 1 year after the government had changed, a government's promises had not been met. She didn't feel as comfortable criticizing the LTT anymore, because now she was witnessing a rape of young children who were recruited by the LTT, but the rape was by Sri Lankan soldiers. So when she told me that incident, she was criticizing both the LTT. That was the point at which she felt really let down by the LTT for putting these children on the line. And at the same time, she was also criticizing the Sri Lankan soldiers. And she didn't want to have this conversation again because she didn't know where she stood. But she told me many other things after that. And many years later, when I asked her again, she said, "If you remember what I've said then, and if you've recorded it, you can write about it, because I don't know how to make sense of it anymore." So I think the way they were looking at it, and there are friends who live in Sri Lanka who at times were happy, or not happy, they were relieved that someone was saying the story, but they were also angry that someone outside was saying the story, because they had still not made sense of where the country is going. I think different politicians have different ideas of where the country should go. A federal structure, more autonomy for the provinces where the Tamils and Muslims live, more equality in a sense. But there's a lot more of what the government should not be doing, which is obvious to many people, but except to the government.
I ask you just about one of the characters in the book, or persons in the book. The worker for the International Red Cross Committee that finds Sarva, that gets him out of the black void. Did you meet him?
Yeah, I did. I did meet him once, and that's why I don't name him, because otherwise the reason I wanted to meet him was because I didn't meet him in person. By then he was out of the country, and I did speak to him on Skype often. I mean, he didn't turn on his video, but we did speak to each other. He only spoke to me on the condition that his name not be mentioned and he not be described physically, and also his time in the ICRC not be mentioned, because it would be obvious who he is. So I spoke to him on Skype, and he also, I asked, he gave me permission. I also asked ICRC for permission to mention that they do this work in prisons, in detention centers, because that was something for a long time that they didn't want known outside. They didn't want exact methods to be known. So I asked them permission if I could write. I sent them that section, and they said okay.
Can I just ask you, in the section where you're describing it, because it was the first time that it showed up, what comes up quite a lot in the book is the presence of forms that people are filling out, and the need to make a story fit into a form, but the kind of the juxtaposition that the story doesn't fit into the form. So when the Red Cross worker gets Sarva's home phone number and meets the family, Sarva's mother wants to know, oh, now that you know about him, he's going to come home. And she asks him, so he'll come home now. And then the Red Cross worker looks at his form and says, let's start at the beginning, what's his name? And so there's a way in which what she wants to know is kind of the presence of the form comes in. So, and you draw attention to this throughout the book, that people need to make it more black and white things. And they're also anticipating, what is it that can go on this form? So Sarva in the UK, one place you can't ever say that, I mean, I have a connection to the LTT. Then in the UK they say, you'll get asylum if you say you have a connection to the LTT. And so this issue of, part of it I have the kind of question of, in what way, like, you felt the kind of creative nonfiction or the nonfiction here is going against another kind of journalistic form. So there's you were referring to a certain style of what people want to know. But then, is this, going back to the first question about audience or something, or you like the Red Cross worker, being asked one thing, but find yourself having to write another thing?
I don't know. I hope I'm not like the ICRC worker. Actually, I use those forms to know thank you for noticing that. And that was my way of saying how black and white it could be made. And these were by people who were trying to help them, and not the state or anybody else. That in a way that the form filling, I should admit, that helped me in some ways, because they remember dates and places perfectly, because they've said it so many times on so many forms to so many people. And then it was the in-betweens that I was interested in. So if you're in that place, is that where you're from, or how did you get there? And in fact, with Sarva's mother, who is my sort of entry point into the Sri Lankan bureaucracy and these forms, actually it was very hard for her to do those things. For her it was easier to talk about how she went to the prison and met him, or how she felt about her son when he was growing up. It was very hard for her to remember in the structure that these forms wanted. So, but these forms, in a way, of course, for nonfiction, not in a way, like directly help a nonfiction writer because they are on record. And then the others, which always are considered the less trustworthy narratives, which is the spoken narrative, which is the description and the memory, I mean, it's always that in creative, not that's the creative part, I guess, that is always questioned or suspected or accused of being fictionalized. So that was what I was afraid of, but that's what I wanted to show, because that gives it the kind of holistic perspective. When, you know, when somebody's grandfather tells them a story about how they were beaten in school, or the teacher, it would be the teacher and how he felt and how he was afraid, not the date and the classroom, what period it was, or so, you know, that, but that doesn't make it any less real. So but still those have to be corroborated for authenticity, which is why I have to meet the ICRC, I have to talk to the ICRC person. There are some people in a family that are record keepers in a sense, and I would find them and haunt them for things. There would be others who are the great storytellers that would embellish, you know. So I would suggest that they have kind of embellished. I would, you know. So the forms help though. All of Sarva's interview in the asylum, for getting asylum, was from a form. I had the recording, and it's from the notes that the asylum, the interviewer took.
Would you like to talk a little bit about I would like to hear from you the interactions you had with the lung soldier.
Okay.
Which language? How did you manage? Is there something you found you surprising, or something different than what you expected?
Yeah, he was a very young soldier, and he was at home in the south because he was there on holiday to farm. And he told me that that's what they often do. They take sick leave and go home during the season to do paddy farming, and he was there doing that. And I met him through a neighbor who lived there, and it was quite a random way of meeting somebody. But he was there, and he was willing to talk about the victory, and he was willing to talk about how he felt, but not really. Obviously, he couldn't talk. He was very afraid of talking to me without permission. But if I sought permission to record his narrative, he was afraid he would lose his job. So it was interesting and surprising to me that in all this rhetoric of Sri Lankan pride and patriotism, for him being in the army was a job, and that if he was in the Sri Lankan army, his family would be taken care of as it is, and that, you know, it gave him a sense of legacy of being part of a future of Sri Lanka. So, you know, he was really young, and I mean, he was 19, and he was just full of both. I don't know. He felt that he had been part of something big, but he was also angry that now that that the war is over, there was no point to his existence in a way, and that he had to now mow lawns and clean parks, which is what the Sri Lankan army, a lot of them, because of the large numbers of them, that's what they do now. So he did not like that. And yeah, that was another thing that was surprising to me, because he was part of something big that he could always tell his grandchildren, but it was now reduced to a kind of labor. He was labor. So yeah, I mean, that was something. I didn't eventually write about him because it would polarize the book. That is one reason. Another is because I just could not get access to him. One, because of the translator that I had. I don't speak Sinhalese, but he could speak English a little bit. But still, you know, his strongest expression would come in Sinhalese. Also, his parents said that I was not to write about him. Yeah, so I mean, permissions, language, and also his fear that this was in some way going to compromise his job, his future. Yeah. But it was like, you know, he was quite similar to a lot of the former combatants that I interviewed, in the way they were looking at being part of a larger cause, but also questioning whether they are just pawns.
Any last question?
Just the life of Sarva in exile or in England, how has he tried to rebuild his life or go on, if that is even a right word, or has there been an attempt to establish some kind of connection that can in a way reconstitute something of what he had before that was positive?
He's one of the few people who seek political asylum and get it, and he got it quite quickly because of the thing that Charles was saying, that when he realized that there's a period in his life in the past that he was forcibly recruited by the LTT. He was trained for 2 years, and that was what was haunting him in Sri Lanka. But that's what actually, that expressing that and admitting to it in the UK to the border agency actually got him his asylum. So he always finds that very fascinating. He's also now, I mean, it's interesting how he has certain skills that are of no use now, which is the difficulty for a lot of people who get like journalists or people who are sort of have elite jobs in a sense, or are very well educated in Sri Lanka, but because of they make this movement into another country which doesn't recognize him for those skills. So he works in a factory that makes plastic bottle caps. It's soul deadening, but you know he's an engineer. I mean, I guess he's a mechanic, but that's the job he wants. But that's the job he will not get probably for many years. He's also family-wise. I mean, of course, he can never go back to Sri Lanka, and that is something that he still is not able to get his head around. And he says, you know, really, if I had known, he knew when he left the country that he would never go back, but he didn't fully know, and that it's in a picture in his mind. And he obsessively looks at things online, tries to know what's going on with his mother and his family through me, through others who meet the family. And, you know, thank God for Skype and things like that. They actually can see each other now. He's also, I mean, I guess I can say it for him, he's married to a person who I've not written about here, and she comes much later in his life after I stopped writing about the book. And he got married to her in India, which is where the families from Sri Lanka came and he went. So I attended his wedding. So in a way, personally, he's okay. He misses his mother and he wants to get her to the UK, but that's not a process that's going to be easy until he gets a lot of money as a deposit. Yeah. So, and emotionally, it helped him to be away from Sri Lanka. He also is he's incredibly, I don't know, resilient is one word, but also he compartmentalizes. He has really compartmentalized his future, present, and past, and that's his way of moving on. He does seem to, he went to some doctors and he said he does seem to exhibit some PTSD because he was tortured. He has attention span problems. So these are things he's still dealing with. He also has physical ailments. He's still dealing with those things, but his greatest disappointment is that he can never see Sri Lanka again or taste the spice as spicy as it was in Sri Lanka.
Well, I ask you to join me in thanking Rohini and Sugi for the presentations this afternoon, and also to recommend to everyone the book, and I think there's copies of the book outside. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.